hopefully one of the characteristics of the Bible that some of you are familiar with is the idea that it is not just a random selection of stories and poems and random statements and genealogies flung together in a single volume and put on the shelves. It's actually a very carefully crafted document. And it's also a single, although there's, it's a library, yes, there's 66 different texts and there's different authors. It's been compiled in such a way that tells one story about Yahweh and how Yahweh operates in the world, what Yahweh is seeking to do in the world through his covenant people. It runs right from Genesis right through to Revelation. And yes, it hops about the timeline a little bit. And yes, you have these different authors and different genres at work. And it's not, a straight linear read from Genesis to Revelation, but by and large, Scripture tells one big story. One of my favorite theologians is N.T. Wright, or Tom Wright, and he has this excellent analogy of the Bible as like a 5-act play. So Act 1 is creation. It's Genesis 1 to 2. It introduces the major characters. So it introduces Yahweh, it introduces the world, and it introduces people made in Yahweh's image. And in Act 2, we see the jeopardy of the story. The plot thickens, if you like, when God's perfectly ordered and created design that is given autonomy to continue creating and ordering itself, or particularly under the stewardship of humans, becomes broken and marred and damaged in some way. And then Act 3 is that's the story of Israel from Abraham right the way through to the minor prophets and up to the start of the New Testament. This is God's saving act through the rest of the Old Testament, basically, and all the prophets and all of the wisdom and the Pentateuch and kind of all these different things. Most of that falls under that one act. Then we get to Act 4, which is Jesus, and everything that goes on around Jesus, where suddenly the jeopardy thing begins to be addressed, the tide begins to turn. The hero has arrived on scene and is beginning to be victorious. And then Act 5, Scene 5, we have this idea of the church. The Spirit comes, the church is established. We kind of actually ourselves, 21st century Christians, get to sit within this act a little bit. And we have a clue as to how the story ends as well. We get an insight into that in Revelation as well. So we can understand the Bible as this long, grand narrative. And one of the best questions I think that we can ask ourselves as we come to the text is, where in the narrative am I? What's happened? What's happening? And what is about to happen? And how does my understanding of where in the narrative I am change how I engage with, interpret the actual text in front of me? So whether you're reading law or poetry or history about the kings or prophecy or parables or apocalyptic literature, how does this help me understand? How does my understanding where I am in the story help me engage well with the text? And, I think there's a couple of things that we can learn from bringing the story lens to our reading. The first is we do need to read widely so that we understand how all of Scripture fits together. I love the lectionary. I think it's really helpful the way it tries to guide people through very key passages and help people engage well. But actually, the lectionary doesn't cover all of Scripture. And Scripture is very self-referential. It riffs on the same ideas again and again and again. I often liken it to, those matching pairs games you get for children where, there'll be a pair of oranges and a pair of apples, a pair of bananas, etc. And you turn all the tiles upside down on the floor. And then as you flick through, you have to try and remember where you've seen the other in that pair. So you might turn over a banana and go, I'm sure I've seen a banana somewhere else before. Where was that? And Scripture often is like that. We can be reading a section and we come across a name or a place or a particular verse or like a phrase. And we go, I'm sure I've seen that before. Where have I seen that before? And that's very deliberate because the writers are constantly picking up on each other's ideas and developing them and riffing off of them and moving them forwards. And the wider we read, the better we are at picking up on those matching pairs and noticing where they come and understanding how they fit together. So when we read something in the New Testament, we think, oh, this reminds me of Isaiah. And oh, actually, this bit in Isaiah reminds me of this bit in Deuteronomy. Oh, and that bit in Deuteronomy actually references that bit in Exodus. We begin to run these threads through. So firstly, we need to read widely. Secondly, because the Bible's a narrative, we need to not always try and jump from verse to timeless truth. I'm going to demonstrate that in a moment, but sometimes we can try and make ourselves the subject without forgetting that this is a story which we get to participate in, but it's not necessarily written about us. Does that make sense? So we, as I say, we are part of Act 5, so we participate in this story. But that means if we're reading something from Act 2 or Act 3, it doesn't necessarily immediately mean it's about us as 21st century Christians today. It doesn't necessarily mean it's timeless truth. So questions that we should ask as we approach the text is, how does this text build or draw upon what's come before? And does it reference anything? If so, how does that shape our reading? Does the author actually know what's coming next? And how might the answer to that inform the way that we engage? So let's apply those questions and the story lens to a passage quickly. Let's look at a fairly familiar verse for many of us. We're going to look at Jeremiah 29 and verse 11, which, if you know it, it goes something like, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future." And this is lovely, isn't it? And we want to own it for ourselves. We want to put it on posters on our wall and on bumper stickers and write it in our journals and on bookmarks and things. And I'm not saying that's not wrong. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not saying that we shouldn't believe that Yahweh is someone who is interested in us and has plans for us. But let's remember that this is a narrative, that it is actually a narrative that falls within Act 3 of Scripture, the story of Israel. Let's remember what's come before, or let's consider what's come before, which is Israel, after continually falling into idolatry, has finally gone into exile in Babylon. And in fact, if we read up from just these few verses, we realize that this passage falls in what is quite a negative chapter as far as Israel is concerned, because all of their own prophets are saying, oh, it's going to be fine. You know, Yahweh's got this in hand. He's going to rescue us. And Jeremiah's come along and go, we're in this for 70 years. So, you know, bed down, buy a house, work out where the supermarket is, get your kids into school, get a job, you know, get to know your neighbors. You're going to be here a while. In fact, you're going to be here for 2 generations. And then he goes on to say, it's not that Yahweh is disinterested. Yahweh does have plans for you. He does have plans to give you the nation, not you, whoever is sat in front of the text in the 21st century in your bedroom reading it. He has plans for Israel, his covenant people, to see them prosper. But right now, these are 2 generations who are going to have to weather the storm of God's judgment for breaking the covenant. And the fascinating thing is, you know, does Jeremiah know what's coming next? Well, the writer of Jeremiah seems to imply that, you know, they've seen something, a taste of the fact it's going to be 70 years, but they don't get to see that. The people receiving this text get to hear that God is for the nation, but that doesn't change the fact that for many of them, they're going to die in exile. For many of them, they get to know that goodness is coming, that God hasn't abandoned the nation. But personally for them, there's not going to be a resolution to the situation they find themselves in. How does that change our interpretation? Does it mean that God doesn't care? No, I don't think it means that. I think it means God is utterly committed to his covenant and his covenant people. But part of his utter commitment to that is when he says, you know, the clauses are, you get my blessing as long as you obey my covenant. Means that if you don't obey his covenant, maybe you don't get his blessing. I mean, that's something which we should probably sit up and take seriously, rather than just wanting to go straight to the la, he knows his plans. Like we need to take seriously the obligation side of that as well. I think there's something really powerful in that, which stops us getting ahead of ourselves and just lifting this out of context. Does Yahweh care? Yes. Does God have plans to prosper his people? Yes. Does that mean that everyone's life is hunky-dory all the time? And that, you know, it means that we have an easy get out of jail free card, or that all of our issues will be resolved for us immediately? I don't think that's what this says. throwing that out there as a challenge. Anyway, that is the story lens. And again, I hope as you come to the Bible and use that as a lens for engaging with Scripture, considering what's come before, what's going on, what's coming after, does the writer have insight into that or not? It will A, help you appreciate how the Bible all links together. B, it will help you be more aware of those little hyperlinks to these other aspects of the Bible, which help us trace the story of the Bible, but also it helps us be better interpreters and appliers of the text in terms of our own lives and where we situate ourselves in it.